Trump is arriving at Davos for the World Economic Forum, says he's serious about annexing Greenland. He's releasing text messages between himself and leaders in Denmark and in other European capitals. The Wall Street Journal said this trade war will be unlike any other. Trump's use of tariffs to annex territory is the logical endpoint of his belief in exploiting American economic leverage. In other words, use tariffs really basically to impose American will on other countries. Greenland has been part of Denmark. Well, it was colonized by Denmark and Norway were one country once upon a time. It was colonized in the 1720s. It was recognized by the United States as part of Denmark in 1916, when the Danish West Indies were sold to the United States for $25 million in gold coins. The Danish West Indies is now called the U.S. Virgin Islands. Anyway, both countries engaged in colonial domination, but the efforts by Trump to basically use American power to seize Greenland, creating havoc within and among the allied countries that constitute NATO and the dominant countries that made up the part of the transatlantic alliance after World War II. Anyway, Trump has his own motives. Maybe he wants to be known as the guy who took Greenland. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts.
Well, as by now you probably know, talking to me over the years we've been doing this, I tend to find useful insights in looking at the history. And I think you do too. You remind us of a part of the history of Denmark and the United States and so on. So let me pick up on that. Capitalism, the modern economic system that dominates the world, has, to its credit, or if you prefer, to its everlasting discredit, the fact that in the 20th century, when it really becomes the global system, it is also a major factor in the two worst wars that the human race has inflicted on itself, World Wars I and World Wars II. Both of those wars were widely understood, certainly in Europe, but even beyond Europe, as having mostly to do with the clashing colonial ambitions of European countries. World War I pitted the British Empire, still the dominant global empire, against its major challenger, which was Germany at that time. Germany was trying to build its empire. The German word for that is Reich, the Deutsche Reich, the German Empire, and it bumped up against the British, as did others. The French had their troubles with the British, the Russians did, all in what was now called Central Asia, and so on. That war was so terrible, the destruction of life and property, and the whole history of countries obliterated in blood, that after the end, it ran from roughly 1914 to roughly 1918. When it was over, a commitment arose that was so powerful, even though it was located in different ways in different cultures of Europe, that it was able to agree we must take steps not to destroy one another over colonial competition. And so they created something called the League of Nations, that everybody was supposed to be a member of, and that would allow and support and encourage European countries to find ways of living together that would not be mechanisms of war. Eventually, two countries that didn't do well in World War I for different reasons, Germany on the one hand, three countries, Italy and Japan, basically disregarded the League of Nations and the whole idea. They were going to use military force to rewrite the map of the world. In other words, to do exactly what led to World War I. And predictably, starting with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the rise to power in Italy of Mussolini in 1922, and then finally the arrival of Mr. Hitler in 1933, the stage was set to use the remainder of the 1930s as a path to the Second World War. And without repeating myself, the same issue, Japan wanted to rewrite the map of Asia, Germany and Italy, the maps of Europe and Africa, and so on. And so we had the United Nations, the redoubling of an effort to not use neither military force nor coercion nor the threat of military force as a way of working out disagreements that would arise among different countries. Now, once again, we see somebody, and here comes the sad news for my American audience, somebody's withdrawing from the United Nations and indeed from a dozen other global agreements. The Paris Agreement to deal with the climate crisis. Mr. Trump, a few weeks ago, proudly announced he was withdrawing the United States from 66 other international organizations, including a whole slew of UN agencies. Here we have it again. And as if we didn't get enough history lesson from what I've just summarized, we have the President of the United States directly and explicitly threatening military action against, and I'm doing this as a partial list, Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, Venezuela already accomplished, Colombia, and Cuba, and Nigeria. An extraordinary surge of colonialism coming after the 20th century, and very shortly after it, when we went through what you would have thought was a cathartic recognition not to proceed in this way. And please notice, Mr. Trump did not ask for an international conference to talk about the Venezuela issue or the Panama issue or the Greenland. He unilaterally took steps, threatening more steps if the early steps didn't suffice to get other countries to get out of the way and give the United States. This looks, smells, and reeks of what Germany and Italy and Japan did after World War I and what we were not supposed to do. And there is lots of effort now to portray all of these actions of Mr. Trump in other ways. And some of them are relevant, it's not that. But we ought to be focused on what's most important to the rest of the world, including Americans, which is not to have World War III because we couldn't learn the lessons of World Wars I and II.
When Lenin wrote his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Richard, which he authored in 1916, it was after the socialist movement, the then existing Second International, the Socialist International, which had mass parties, including the German Party, which was the largest party in the German parliament. By 1910 in the Reichstag, the German Socialist Party had 1/3 of all of the seats, much bigger than any other party. And they had said at different congresses of the Second International, at the Basel Congress in particular, right before the war, that should a war come, like World War I was, should it come, The socialists would work to end the war, to protest against the war, but if that failed, that they would take advantage of the war to try to topple their own capitalist government and create a socialist government. It was a pledge that they each made to each other, and it was a solemn pledge. And then the war came, and Lenin was so shocked, he thought it was a propaganda trick at first by the German government to say that Kautsky and the German Socialist Party, the great party, the flagship party of the Second International, had voted for war credits, was going along with the war effort by the German government. And then all of the other socialist parties, or almost all of them, did the same thing. So Lenin wrote this book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And the essence of the book, outside of him trying to explain what modern imperialism is, et cetera, and he tried to write it so that it could get through a censor, so it wasn't all of his thinking. He basically said, look, all of the different entities here are predatory. There is no progressive side to the war. If you're trying to find a progressive side, you won't find one. And everybody can make an excuse for why they're defending their own government. But imperialism as a system or capitalism as a system has evolved into this imperialist stage. And then we had World War I, and as you said, it followed up 20 years later with World War II. Between the two wars, 100 million people died in a very short amount of time. And then you would have thought, okay, that part of Lenin's analysis is no longer relevant because we went through an era of decolonization, and the capitalist powers basically accommodated themselves to that. So I'm getting to this point. Is Trump's actions here a complete sort of anomaly, a personal weirdness on the part of a weird political leader? And of course, he is weird and filled with delusional narcissism. But when you think about the fact, Richard, that the Republican Party is going along with him, and he's not going to run again, he's basically a lame duck politician, is it really an anomaly, or are we entering some other stage, moving again in the direction of global war 80 years after the UN was formed, where on its front door it says to end the scourge of war, meaning global wars? Anyway, what's your take on all of that?
To be direct and blunt in the interest of the time limits that this program always has, I'm afraid my answer has to be that there are very good reasons for why Mr. Trump is doing what he's doing. I'm not arguing that he isn't anomalous in all kinds of ways. He made his career by saying, I'm different from the traditional Republican Party. That's how he beat the Bush family and its control on that party. And as soon as he had shown the Republicans how different he was from their traditional leadership, he showed it for the Democrats, Biden and Harris as well. And so, yeah, he's unique in various ways. And yes, he's narcissistic and all. I'm not disputing it. I really am not. But that never answers the question, why does his narcissism or his uniqueness or his fill in whatever the blank is about his personal characteristic, why do they take this direction and this form at this time? And the minute you ask that question, you have to do the historical work. You have to show what the pressures were that he then applied his narcissistic uniqueness to. And here they are. And here they are given to us by the history. What drove Germany and Britain finally to declare war? And they were the two major combatants. The French sided with the British, the others sided with the German. But we know it was the clash of their colonial empires. They were literally fighting each other over Africa, starting in the 1880s. They had carved up Africa, mostly between the two of them. France got a big chunk, but it was mostly a German-British confrontation. And they were confronting each other in Asia, and they were confronted on Europe and in the Middle East, and on and on and on. And Britain didn't want its empire threatened by the rise of the Germans. And the Germans didn't want their empire shut down, their empire ambitions, by the old British Empire, which didn't want to tolerate anyone else. Well, fast forward to today, what have we got? A declining American empire, outraged that the Chinese, above all, but their allies in Russia, are challenging, are saying, no, you can't go NATO into Ukraine. No, you can't do this over here. We're going to make deals with Maduro in Venezuela and the Cubans and much of Africa. It's a clash of these. And Mr. Trump is trying to do what the leaders in World Wars I and II tried to do. Stop it. One of the ways to stop it is to try to give the other side the impression, a little bit like a peacock has those fantastic feathers. When it feels endangered, it becomes 6 times larger than it normally is by spreading the feathers and hoping the enemies will be intimidated. Mr. Trump is letting the world know, yes, it's true we don't have the economic clout we once did. Yes, it's true we don't have the political clout. We get outvoted in the UN every day. But we still have the military clout, and we're still rich enough that if we can close our markets to you, that's the tariff program, we can hurt you. And you better give us our empire needs, or else we'll close off our economy, tariffs. And because that did not succeed, very important, the tariff program didn't succeed. He cannot impose high enough tariffs on enough countries to get the world economy back to where it was. That's a failure. It's raised about $200 billion, but that's chicken feed, if you allow me, given the deficits of the United States. When he announced last week that the defense budget alone is going to go to $1.5 trillion, that's $600 billion over what it was this year, that wipes out not just what the tariffs have already gotten, it's about 3 times what the tariffs are expected to bring on an annual basis, and that's just 1 year's increase. In other words, all that's gone. So what's going to fool anybody anymore? Answer, the last step, military. If you don't do what I want, I'll hit you with a tariff. And if you don't do what I want with the tariff, I'll raise the tariff. And if you don't do what I want with the raised tariff, military means are on the table. And literally, to illustrate how serious he is, we have the Maduro abduction as a kind of made-for-TV threat. Tell me I've made a mistake in something I've done, but I've given you the history. Seems to me the history is screaming its message at us right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. And people would have thought, well, there can't be a repeat of World War I and World War II because now the different parties have nuclear weapons. And so as bad as World War I and World War II were, where you had industrial methods for military fighting really for the first time, which allowed millions to be killed, within months, right, sometimes within a couple of weeks in certain battles. This industrial level of killing. The world hadn't seen that before. Now you have nuclear weapons. So people think, well, okay, now there would be mutually assured destruction. So logic, rationality, saneness would prevent people from going to war that would lead to their own, destruction. But I remember in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy, the 2 Kennedy brothers came out of those discussions with the military, when the Soviet Union dared to put missiles in Cuba 90 miles from America to contradict America putting missiles in Turkey and all around the Soviet Union, Kennedy came out and said, hey, the military is mad, meaning they're crazy, meaning they were ready to go to thermonuclear war because their line was, look, war is coming. War is inevitable. Let's hit them now when they're weaker, not when they're stronger. And they were willing to take like 30, 40, 50 million American casualties because America would win. I mean, this kind of thinking starts to predominate. If war is inevitable, let's get it over with because the other side's only going to get stronger. Anyway, these are some of the dynamics that lead to war. By the way, and just I'll finish on this point. Britain, which is the main U.S. ally, and has been the special junior partner for quite some time, they just agreed to allow the Chinese to build this vast embassy in London. And the Americans have been saying for a long time, you can't let that happen. We're not going to let you do it. And Starmer, in spite of the fact that the British government, whether it's a Tory government or a Labour government, is so beholden to the U.S., they were like, no, we're letting the Chinese build this giant embassy. And it's an indicator that even the British know that the future is not with America, or at least they certainly don't want to put all their eggs in an American basket.
Again, there's so many dimensions of this, but let me take off from what you just said. There was an argument that exploded last night and today between the British and the United States about an American-British military, a shared military base on an obscure island in the Pacific called Diego Garcia. Now, as recently as last May, Marco Rubio celebrated the decision, approved it by the British to give the legal authority over this island to Mauritius, which is a country out there, which is an independent country, and which has claimed these islands for a very long time. They were about to take legal steps to bring those islands back under their control, and the British thought, with American approval, don't have a fight over this, give them. They're willing to let the Americans and the British continue to have their base. Just like in Greenland, they're willing to let the Americans continue to have the several bases that the Americans have built in Greenland and make that a commitment of many years into the future. Mr. Trump, because of the need to do what I just talked about, to symbolically negate the decline of the empire, turned around sometime late last night or this morning on his own Truth Social social media and called Keir Starmer stupid. Stupid. I mean, that's the word, stupidity, for having done what Mr. Trump approved through his Secretary of State and never disapproved. And didn't since May when that was done. Here we are, January of the following year. Suddenly it becomes important to take the one ally left in Europe who's holding back from the kinds of statements that even Macron and Merz are making in Germany, and to turn around and smash him one. You are watching somebody who has decided, and the Europeans still can't face it, has decided that the best interests of the United States are served not by maintaining the alliance, but by actively destroying it. And that it's an enormously interesting thing for a declining empire that has a solid alliance to do away with that alliance. The Europeans make a politics out of feeling threatened by Russia. The United States makes a politics by being threatened by China. The reality is that neither Russia nor China are challenging in most of the places of the world. They're not talking like Mr. Trump. They're not threatening. They're not grabbing, nothing. Even whatever you think of Ukraine, the argument that they're trying to hold back NATO's expansion is an argument that sits there, cannot be refuted. What's the excuse of the United States? Venezuela threatened it? That's ridiculous. Greenland threatened the more ridiculous. And if the reason is to protect against China and Russia, imagine for a moment if Russia and China used such a logic relative to the United States. They'd have more grounds, but the whole world would be up in arms at the very thought of such a thing.